This week, President Trump ended waivers for Iranian oil. It amounts to some of the heaviest sanctions the regime has ever faced. What is the president hoping to accomplish, and will it work? Hello and welcome to Deep Dive. I'm your host, Bill McGurn from the Wall Street Journal. Only a few years ago, President Barack Obama put America on a new footing with Iran when he ended the sanctions in exchange for a nuclear deal. Under that deal, Iran agreed to forego nuclear weapons development for at least a decade. But during his campaign for the White House, Donald Trump says this was a very bad deal and promised to take the U.S. out. Now he's done it and restored sanctions that are taking a big bite out of Iran's economy. The question is, what's the end game here? And is Iran's foreign minister correct to say that the problem Iran has is not with President Trump, but his national security advisor, John Bolton? Joining me today to discuss are Sohrab Ahmari, an Iranian-born writer who is both the op-ed editor at the New York Post and contributing editor at the Catholic Herald. Behnam Ben Taleblu, senior fellow at the Foundation of Defense of Democracies, where he focuses on Iranian security and political issues. And Michael Pregent, senior Middle East analysis, senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, and a former U.S. Army intelligence officer. Thank you all for being here. Let's start with the basics. What happened this week? The sanctions have been in place for a while, but why is what happened this week such a big deal?
Well, great to be with you guys. Essentially, President Trump is looking to bring max pressure to 11 on the pressure scale by ending oil waivers, which is the lifeblood oil of the Iranian
And the waivers were exemptions. When he announced the sanctions months ago, there were exemptions granted to, I believe, 8 countries that were important to kind of ease them off, but give them a transition period, right? Absolutely. So now, and some of these were the big customers for Iran, so now that's a big deal that's being lifted, right?
That's right. Major Asian hydrocarbon economies like China and India, and these countries were importing Iranian oil at pre-2011 levels, which was the levels that Iran exported prior to the oil sanctions under President Obama. And so this means the administration is serious about putting pressure on Iran's economy and serious about driving the regime back to the negotiating table. Now,
clearly they have to worry about the effect on prices, right? Oil's a global commodity. There's some talk that the other nations that are net exporters of oil, including the U.S. now, can up their game and cover. Do you think that can be made up? Like, in other words, will American consumers feel the results of this?
I think there will be a very, very, very short-term price hike.
Short spike in prices.
For Brent. But otherwise, countries, particularly the major Asian countries who claim that there is no alternative source of oil, are simply lying. South Korea, for instance, gets condensate from Iran. You can get ultralight Kuwaiti or American oil. Other countries have the capability to step up. Saudi Arabia has spare production. There'll be an OPEC meeting in June to determine if Saudi will actually ramp up or not. Right. But a lot of this actually does exist on the market, and we want to make sure that there is still a well-supplied oil market so that Iran can be had over a barrel, literally.
And it's because Iran's economy isn't that developed, right? Oil is the major piece, right? They're very vulnerable in this sense, right? Because that's their major export, major source of foreign currency.
And also the major export of terrorism, and with that, they're able to penetrate other economies. We've seen Iran penetrate Iraq's economic sectors. They've done the same in Syria. They've done the same in Lebanon. And this is a way to,
with the cash that it generates, right? And investing.
Right. So as you have the revenue from oil, but then you also have the revenue from the black market, penetration of other countries' economic sectors. The sanctions are working. The oil waivers are working as well. We do expect Turkey and China to continue, but it gives the U.S. levers.
When you say working, what do you mean by it's working? Well, a lot of people say it doesn't work.
Right. So it wasn't working when we were in the JCPOA, the Iran deal.
Right.
The regime still squandered away the economic benefits of the Iran deal.
Right.
European companies were still hesitant to invest in Iran. So even before the sanctions, they were still not managing their economy at all. So with the sanctions in place, we're now seeing clients like Lebanese Hezbollah, Iraqi militias, Assad in Syria. A lot of the payments that used to go to these terrorist organizations and also to a dictator.
So it's a crimp
Assad.
in what they're able to do. It's not just the lifestyle at home, but what they're able to do abroad, because I mean, one of the big concerns is that in the Middle East, it's spreading out, right? That it's exerting influence all over the region in a bad way, and that's the cash helps, right?
Right. The loudest voice is coming from inside Iran, where the
Right.
Iranian people are saying, "Stop doing this in Iraq. Stop doing this in Syria. Stop sending money or spending money on other things."
Right.
So anytime the regime does something external to Iran, or a ballistic missile test, the Iranian people say, "Well, what about us? We're spending $6 an egg, the equivalent of if you're on a $6,000 a year salary." The people are saying, "Stop this adventurism. Stop mismanaging the economy." And so the sanctions are working. The FTO designation really helps. That's the Foreign Terrorist Organization designation, because again, the IRGC has penetrated all of Iran's economy.
Right.
And therefore, any countries that touch Iran's economy are now under the threat of U.S. secondary sanctions.
Right. Sorry, but I want to push back a little on the sanctions thing. I've been a sanctions skeptic, not about Iran, for years, just because when I lived, for example, in Asia, we had sanctions on North Korea and on Vietnam and on Cuba, and it hadn't done anything to change the regime. Now, I recognize that they can inflict pain, but do you think that's going to achieve what we want? The foreign minister, for example, bunch of us from the Wall Street Journal met with Iran's foreign minister about 10 days ago, and he said this is a wrong assumption. He said, yes, it hurts. These sanctions hurt. He didn't mince words about that, but he said, if you think it's going to result in government change, meaning change of policy, you're wrong. And in fact, he said it's likely to create an idea among the Iranian people that engagement isn't worth it, right? Forget trying to work out stuff with the U.S. It's not going to work it. What's your take on?
Well, I think, look, the question that Washington has to ask itself is ultimately, what do we want with Iran? Do we want to just change its behavior? Do we want to change the regime? Once that question is answered, then everything else will flow from it, and sanctions are part of a program of measures you might take with respect to a regime like Iran, but they can't be an end in themselves, and touting them as an end in themselves, I think, is a mistake, and I think you're right. As far as the people rallying to the flag, though, I think it's interesting because that plays to a certain kind of audience here in the U.S. as well. You'll remember in, I want to say, November 2017, the New York Times ran an article by Thomas Erdbrink, their Tehran correspondent, who said Trump's bellicose language and Saudi Arabia's bellicose posture is rallying the people around the flag. A month later, massive protests broke out, where people said precisely the slogans that Michael mentioned. Why are you spending money on Syria? Do something for me. Why are you out in Iraq doing whatever?
And we don't know what the popular discontent is because people get arrested, right? When they show and they get chucked into jail.
But clearly, the idea that sanctions pressure means people rally around the flag, we've seen that too often. The facts defy that theory.
Now, you just wrote a piece, we were talking before. One of the foreign minister's points, I thought he was a very clever advocate for Iran's, excellent English, kind of appealed to American understandings. And one of the things he complained about was the 4 Bs. John Bolton, Bibi Netanyahu, Bin Zayed, I think, and I'm trying to remember.
And Bill Salman.
Right. So, and he blames these people for wanting regime change, for being bellicose. And ironically, he didn't blame Donald Trump. He's trying to create a wedge between the National Security Advisor and the president by suggesting John Bolton wants something much more dramatic like war with Iran, where Donald Trump is just saying this to get them to the table. He didn't think either would work, but that's where he was going with this.
And it's a very astute observation by Zarif, who knows our politics, who lives here, who, as you said, has a great command of English. But I think that's part of the problem, that he knows us too well. And for the past few years, whether you're on the left or on the right, our domestic politics have been on full display. So Iran's strategy here has been adapting. If you look at what Politico reported last November, North Korea and Turkey had been making sure to praise the president while critiquing Washington. Right. Iran, for the past year and a half, had been saying that Trump is part of the Washington problem.
Right.
Now Iran seems to be adjusting a little bit, trying to drive a wedge between Trump and the rest of his administration and the rest of his allies abroad, much like the Iranians did last May when they cleaved apart the transatlantic community.
Right.
The Europeans on one side.
John Bolton, for his part, just on the one member of the B team, points out that Donald Trump campaigned against this deal when he was candidate. Like long before John Bolton joined the administration, Donald Trump was saying some of these things. So the idea that they came in and reversed policy on the basis of John Bolton doesn't really
exactly
hold up to an analysis, does it?
It doesn't, but it's a last-minute play here by the Iranians because they really are feeling the pennies being pinched because of the max pressure campaign. But Iran's strategy has been primarily diplomatic in the face of max pressure, and I like to say that the Iranians are playing this game of max patience in the face of max pressure, because something else that Zarif has learned is the political clock, the political timeline. And they now understand that our max pressure campaign is tied to one individual, President Donald J. Trump. And if there's a change in the White House in 2020, many of the Democrats right now, at least per the official DNC platform, would seek to rejoin the deal. That would be a problem. That would be a strategic win for the Iranians.
Right.
That's something I think the Iranians are looking to exploit. And that's why they want to be patient, at least for now, in the face of pressure.
Let's talk a little bit about Iran and the U.S. A lot of people, especially after the Iraq War, I remember when I was in the Bush White House during that time, and we were learning of the things that Iran had done, like supplied the IEDs that were blowing up our troops, right? The public had no appetite for taking on Iran when we were bogged down in Iraq. But run through some of the anti-American. I mean, this isn't just a neutral country that's leaving us alone, or even a country that's just causing mischief in its neighbors. It's directly against the U.S. There's a lot of U.S. treasure and blood on Iran's hands.
There is. Initially, when we went into Iraq, Iran saw U.S. forces in Afghanistan, saw U.S. forces in Iraq, and thought they were next. The IRGC Quds Force started, Qasem Soleimani's hybrid special operations terrorist force started using Arabs to kill Americans, introducing lethal aid to Arab militias to kill Americans. 603 now.
Right, there was the announcement, Brian Hook at State Department announced that
there's far,
last month.
Right, and there's far more that were injured because of that.
And there's their involvement. I mean, one of the sneaky things about Iran is that it frequently does it through proxies, right? I mean, often it doesn't do it itself. It does it through these proxies. So, for example, the Khobar Towers bombing in Saudi Arabia that killed some of our people was Iranian backed.
Right, and then Lebanese Hezbollah operations going back to 84 and 85, or 83 and 85. The thing about it, you know, as Zarif tries to exercise patience, we're hearing a lot of rhetoric from the IRGC leadership, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, closing down the Straits of Hormuz, attacking Americans, welcoming a war with America, looking to wipe Israel off the face of the map. So as Zarif tries this strategic campaign of patience, we have examples of what Iran threatens to do. And it's harder to do that now being designated a foreign terrorist organization.
And the military, right, the Revolutionary Guard. This is unique, I think, right, for a country's military to be designated as a
historic
terrorist.
Right?
It is, but I look at them as more like the SS than the actual regular army.
Right.
They answer directly to the supreme leader. They don't fall under the Ministry of Defense. And again, they'll have to rely on Arabs to kill Americans. And we've actually have some proxies in Iraq that have even been designated as terrorist organizations preemptively tell Qasem Soleimani, we will not attack Americans. And that's a first. The other thing is it's different when the IRGC, a military, is designated as a foreign terrorist organization. If a Navy shuts down the Straits of Hormuz, it's a big deal. The international community will get behind it. If a foreign terrorist organization's Navy does it, then there's a little bit more leeway when it comes to what to do militarily.
Right. And then I wanted to, again, press this point about Americans. I mean, it has, I believe, 4 Americans detained there now, right? Frequently they're Americans of Iranian descent who go back and are picked up. They had a bunch before, right? And one was the former Marine who was sending out messages, don't negotiate for my release, you know, don't make any deal for my release. He wanted it on clean terms. But the incentive is when we negotiate the way we have is, okay, they get rid of these 3 guys and they pick up 3 more, right? Isn't it? I mean, that's the problem with and we still have, it strikes me as outrageous that the Obama administration let that deal go through without accounting for Bob Levinson, an former FBI agent who was there on CIA business, I think we now know, it's been public. So he's not just an American, he's American representing the United States government. He disappears and there's no accountability.
He's come back up on the radar now, which is a good thing. But the thing about rewarding bad behavior, and we set a terrible precedent by paying a ransom for the release of 4 Americans. In addition to that, giving Iran back 23 individuals that the FBI had.
Well, they want to make a swap for.
They want to do it again.
Zarif offered another swap here.
They want to do it again. I'll kick it to the experts here on.
Yeah, tell us they offered another swap there now, right?
And I think that's just an attempt by Zarif to have a premature off-ramp to the max pressure campaign. Come out here, put out some feelers, see what happens. And Iran, whether it's on the nuclear issue alone or on hostage-taking alone or occasionally deconfliction in Iraq, what they do is they make sure that you can't get anything comprehensive on them. They say, oh, let's do this small deal, let's build some confidence, but there will be no confidence translated over because they're looking to keep their relationship with you highly transactional so they can have you over a barrel, they can take.
And again, if all you have to do is go out and nab some American who's visiting his relatives in Iran, you get leverage, right? Whatever you give up, you can get right back the next week.
And they've done it in the 80s with Lebanese Hezbollah too.
Right.
Yeah.
Just real quickly, I would say that any overtures that our government uses towards the Iranian regime delegitimizes the opposition by legitimizing a government.
Right.
This is a regime in crisis. They're being told to wait out until 2020. Help is coming. It's a mistake to re-enter the JCPOA without renegotiating the JCPOA, the Iran deal, because everything expires in the second term of whoever is president in 2027. The regime can survive the next 20 months. They can't survive another 6 years of maximum pressure.
Right.
And I think we need to let it stay in place for a while, and instead of constantly, a week after announcing sanctions, the next day saying, well, we're going to carve out this area. We're going to say that these countries have waivers. Let it stew for a little while. We have an advantage here. The paranoia that takes place in Tehran based on the messaging that comes out of Washington, D.C. and New York should be allowed to simmer a little bit.
I'm a hardliner, so I'm myself, but if you Google Trump's policy, Iran, sanctions or something, you'll have 1,000 articles saying it's not going to work, too tough, too strong. Is that your read of how, I mean, some people say we're in this predicament because we've been too soft all the time, that they only respond to pressure.
The only examples I can think of have been in response to pressure when the Iranian regime has backed down, most notably after the invasion of Iraq. You'll suddenly remember the tone changed from Tehran, but no, that's how I see them, and they're thugs. You have to think about them. They have an ideological component, and there are people in the regime who have messianic ideas and so forth. But plenty of them are just thuggish, and the way you deal with the schoolyard bully is
now in America we have this idea, because people make fun of the mullahs and so forth, and we remember the hostages. But I think sometimes it gets lost that there's there's sort of two Irans, and Iran's a very sophisticated country with a very sophisticated populace, or at least half the populace, right? That are not like these guys.
And so, and those people are really frustrated.
Right.
I mean, even before President Trump pulled out of the nuclear deal, there was all this economic deprivation. And what's really scary for the regime is that it's no longer just those sophisticated people who come out into the streets, the urban, middle class, educated. It's working class people. It's people in the provinces, the people who are supposed to be the backbone of the regime. This was a revolution for the dispossessed, as Khomeini said.
Right.
It's the dispossessed who are coming out and saying, they will go to Friday prayers and they'll chant while the sermon's going on. They'll start chanting. They'll say, they tell us the enemy is America when we know the enemy is right here, which they mean the regime. This is working class people. That's terrifying.
Well, I think it was Michael was mentioning some of that discontent with, why are you spending money on Hezbollah abroad rather than doing it here? So, so you don't agree with the foreign minister that the tough policies that we have, especially the sanctions, which probably are being felt by ordinary Iranians, is going to do what the foreign minister thinks it's going to do, which is get people to support the regime over the U.S.
Especially because, these people didn't fall off the turnip truck yesterday. So they've been through cycles of the regime saying, here's a reformist now, here's the moderate, this and that.
It's interesting that the regime is admitting the sanctions are having they're clearly hurting in a way that they haven't
Yes, and so
before.
cynicism has set in on the part of the people where they know that the regime has ran out of the usual rhetorical cards that it could play about reform coming every 4 years and then the hardliner, this and that. They realize it's all the same regime.
So what do you think, short of regime change, maybe it is regime change, what do you think the U.S., what does the U.S. want out of Iran? I mean, what would we regard as a successful outcome?
You know, thinking very long term, it shouldn't be liberal democracy. I've really been thinking about this and reading Iranian history, and it has 2,500 years of absolutist rule. It's one of those societies that has a kind of authoritarian character. I'm willing to say that the political culture is authoritarian. But if either within the regime or outside it, some figure emerges who can redirect Iran as a project to be a proper nation state.
Well, does that have to mean regime change, or would we be satisfied just with major behavior change?
I don't think this regime changes its.
You don't think it's possible for this kind of regime?
Being obnoxious, poking the West in the eye all the time is baked into its DNA in a way. So I don't think. But if some ambitious general emerges within the IRGC who has other ideas, maybe, or something, that's the kind of scale of thing.
You know, and the other I think misimpression is when we think of the Middle East, in America at least, we so often think of it dominated by the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I just know when I used to travel the Middle East with President Bush, the Arab leaders they're not concerned about Israel. They might publicly say things or not say support, but they don't get up thinking the Israelis are going to attack me. They are worried about Iran, and they see Iran in 4 Arab countries: Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, and so forth, and Iraq, and they worry about, and rightly so. They worry because what they see is an aggressive Shia power reaching out into all these other areas, right? I mean, that's why we have a bloody war in Yemen. Now, we could say the Saudis are not doing a good job in waging it, and it's very brutal, but there's a reason that they're there.
And there's a very interesting mind meld, I think, going on here, because the people protesting in Iran today, as Sohrab said, they're the blue collar, the downtrodden, the dispossessed. They're the people who are echoing the statements we heard from the people with genes cooler than you and I in 2009 in Tehran. Right. And once the regime realizes that, they know they're in trouble. But their slogans actually, in 2017 to present, are just as nationalist, if not more nationalist. And in many places around the world today, when you see nationalism as a toxic force, a possibly dangerous force, nationalism in Iran, especially by this crowd, is not a force of irredentism, is a genuinely patriotic force. It's a,
and also it has
Iran force.
It's one of the
come
oldest
out of Syria, come out of
cultures
Lebanon.
in the world, right?
Exactly.
I mean, there's been
there's so much to be proud
thousands of years.
And for the past 40 years, there's been absolutely nothing to be proud of. And I can say that as an Iranian American. Sitting next to another Iranian American. What is there to be proud of? What dignity is there behind the Iranian passport, behind that flag, behind that anthem? There's very little there that I think Iranians who are cognizant of this history, especially the past century-long struggle for representative government, that they can feel that they're proud of.
You can go to Zimbabwe visa-free. That's right.
Maybe collecting a 1 million Zimbabwean note is something to be proud of, but other than that.
For the people that think that the White House is just picky, like we should just stay out of the Middle East and so forth. Again, the behaviors that we're most concerned about, I think, is Iran's missile development and its spread into these other places. Again, usually through proxies, so it's disguised a little bit. I mean, that's the behavior that, not so much the internal regime, but that's the behavior that makes it an issue for the United States and everyone else in the Middle East.
Well,
and they're the leading state sponsor of terrorism, are they not?
Right. Well, Ben's writing a piece on the Iranian land bridge, and we've done some work on this. And the real concern out of the National Security Council, at least when we've talked to them the last year, has been the proxy war between Iran and Israel in southern Syria, or the coming war between Iran and Israel that's already taken shape in southern Syria. These ballistic missiles are not going to be launched from, they will be launched from Tehran, but these other missiles that they're putting in, these guided missiles, are being launched from Syria. They want to put that capability into Iraq to have proxies also threaten our Gulf allies, like Saudi Arabia. This is a concern. It's not the fact that, when you look at the Iran deal, it deals with ballistic missiles. It doesn't deal with ballistic missiles. It deals with them becoming a nuclear power over time. But if you look at everything Iran has done up to date, it goes back to what you said. When you travel the region, Sunni leaders, in charge of intelligence organizations will say ISIS is easy to defeat. It's Iran that's the problem. And if Iran continues
in the long term, because it is a nation and it has the infrastructure.
And it's
of
not
a
the
nation,
people,
right?
it's the regime. And as long as there are Shia militias, there are no examples of Shia militias killing ISIS in Syria. They did it in Iraq, but they targeted the Sunni population to do it. The regime needs the threat of ISIS to justify putting
that
these
it's a
proxies in
civilized,
place.
it's part of a force.
And the argument that they try to use, people from other groups try to use this argument that Iran is an ally in this war on terror against ISIS. I go, no, you're not. You're destabilizing and fracturing countries in order for these existential threats to emerge, like ISIS and Al-Qaeda iteration, whichever one we're going to face. And that's the real concern. They have a proxy network that can now deliver guided missiles to our allies. We need to look at that. And if Democrats re-enter the JCPOA without conditions, then by adhering to the JCPOA as it is now, Iran will become a conventional military power, an economic power over time, have a ballistic missile capability, and at the end of the sunset clauses, be allowed to put a warhead on top of a ballistic missile.
That would be, that's interesting you say that, because if the Democrats came in and tried to restore it, it'd be much further down the line of that agreement.
In Kamala Harris's second term, Iran would be putting a warhead on the
They wouldn't be able to, President Obama was partly able to do this because it's 10 years off. You know, someone could come in and...
Well, he had a key phrase during the negotiations. He said, Iran will never have a nuclear weapon on my watch. And he said, well, you're going to be in office for 18 months.
You're going to kick the can down to someone else. So what do you think, as we're looking at Iran, what would be signs that the regime is in trouble, that they say? Because again, I believe that the pressure on President Bush is going to be all to lift them, that you're just encouraging hardliners. We've heard this all before. It's going to be difficult to sustain, don't you think?
I mean, if the pace of protests since 2017, the winter of 2017 leading into 2018, has not really relented. I mean, it's gone on. But the point is, if you start seeing more of these sort of bread riots, I would say that's one point. And then interesting fissures within the regime. And you have to think, all of this is happening at a time when supposedly the supreme leader has prostate cancer. And he's not young. He's not a young man. So what would that transition look like? How prepared is the regime to transition leadership, this sort of quasi-messianic figure of the leader, at a time when it's also facing economic pressure, isolation, and so forth?
And one thing to look at is not just the protests, because those are diverse and continuing, but also the nature and type of force that the regime uses against these. Because remember, the Shah fell in 78, 79, because not just the street, but because his own forces refused to shoot. And right now, I think Iran understands that most of the forces will shoot. We've seen relatively cohesive, but not relatively cohesive forces take on protesters in different ways in 94, 99, 2009, 2017. They're learning from each iteration. They're learning how critical we are. They're learning how people use telecommunications technology, and they're learning what is the minimum they can do to have the maximum output, which is why they rape people, they torture people, they take them into jails, they scare them, they use helicopters and vigilantes. And what's the problem? The problem now is there's massive flooding in Iran. And because of these floods, Iran is deploying Arab Shia militias to do flood relief in some of these provinces hit very hard by the floods. So once these floods dissipate and protests come up, you can bet your bottom dollar that Iran will be using foreign forces to put down its own people. There were rumors of this in 2009, that you heard Arabic on the streets, but it was hard to get evidence. But now the threat of this actually becoming a reality after the flood relief is actually dangerous.
Michael, I have to leave the last question to you. Again, in this meeting that we had with the foreign minister, he said they weren't looking at 2020. In other words, they were saying what every country would say: we form our policy, we don't form our policy on the basis of who's in office and so forth. However, if Donald Trump were to win re-election in 2020, and presumably if these are the sanctions and the other programs to tamp down Iran are kept in place, that's not a happy scenario for these guys, is it, looking forward?
The most likely scenario is they'll come to the table ready to renegotiate the Iran deal. But then again, that undercuts everything we're talking about. That's not going to make the Iranian people happy. It's simply going to be something that the regime once again promises to do while Donald Trump's in office.
Right.
And Iran has always cheated out in the open on UN Security Council
Right.
resolutions. And our colleagues on the other side of the aisle say, well, they're adhering to it in the shadows. So if you cheat in the open, and we have to believe you're not in the shadows, I mean, we just can't think that way. So they're definitely looking at 2020 if he wins.
Well, if he wins, it's presumably another 4 years of a tough policy, a real squeeze on them, right?
With
Where
these
we
2
might
years
achieve
now?
some of our goals in terms of taming its behavior, if not entire regime change. Anyway, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you all for coming today. I'm Bill McGurn from the Wall Street Journal. Please tune in for the next deep dive.